Good morning, bonjour à tous. My name is Gegê Leme Joseph, and I am the Senior Program Manager for Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean at the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. I am honored to be here today and to join this important seminar, which will set the stage for the creation of a national museum for Djibouti. I do apologize for speaking in English, which is not my first language, but nevertheless is the foreign language I am most comfortable with. For those of you who don't know our work, the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience is a global network of nearly 400 museums, historic sites, and archives and memory initiatives in over 80 countries that champion memory, truth, and justice around the world. We work with our members through capacity building, networking opportunities, and grants to help them, support them to provide their communities with transformative experiences that help them to counter false narratives, embrace more inclusive histories, and advocate for just, equitable systems today. The theme, the museum in question, invites us to critically examine the evolving role of museums in our societies. It challenges us to reimagine museums as dynamic spaces for dialogue, inclusion, and transformation, reflecting the diversity, resilience, and creativity of the communities they represent. The establishment of a national museum for Djibouti is an extraordinary opportunity to lead by example, to allow us to rethink traditional museum practices and embrace co-creation processes that reflect the rich history, cultural diversity, and aspirations of Djiboutian society. So this presentation today, I aim to explore how innovative perspectives in museum theory and practice can ensure or support the museum to become a dynamic, inclusive space for healing, learning, and community transformation. Drawing from my experience with the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, I will share insights on how museums can adopt methodologies that center local communities, elevate diverse narratives, and advance equity, sustainability, and healing. And these reflections will be framed by four core questions. How can museums connect the past and present to foster transformation? How can they engage in decolonial practices that challenge dominant narratives? How can they prioritize community driven methods to ensure inclusivity and long term relevance? And how can these approaches redefine our relationship with the natural world? To set the stage, I would like to start with a brief historical context. Museums trace their origins to ancient traditions of collecting and preserving objects. The term museum comes from the Greek mouseion, a shrine to the Muses, and a hub for arts and intellectual pursuits. Early prototypes emerged in Hellenistic culture as spaces for teaching and learning. Um, During the Renaissance in 16th century Europe, the cabinets of curiosities emerged as collections juxtaposing cultural and natural objects. These displays symbolized power, wealth, and knowledge, accessible only to an elite. By the 18th century, the emergence of the so called encyclopedic or universal museums took place, and they aimed to catalog the world's knowledge. However, these institutions were deeply entwined with colonial enterprises, acquiring objects through exploitative means and framing them within Western centric narratives. This approach disconnected objects from the cultural and natural contexts and positioned Western scholars as the sole interpreters of universal truths, naturalizing colonial dominance and shaping the institutionalization of museums in the future. In the 19th century, national museums also emerged as tools for shaping national identity and promoting state narratives. At the time, these institutions often highlighted majority cultures while marginalizing diverse voices within and beyond their borders. Their architecture, exhibition methods, and compartmentalized displays were designed to project authority and instill acceptable social behavior in their visitors. Then, by the mid 20th century, these legacies faced growing scrutiny. influenced by post-colonial thinkers such as Frantz Fanon and Paulo Freire, critical questions arose about whose stories museums told, how collections were presented, and who ultimately benefited from them. These critiques spurred calls for decolonization and greater social relevance, emphasizing not only the return of artifacts, but also the redefinition of museums themselves as spaces for community representation, engagement, and equity. Building on this historical context and transformation, new approaches to museum making emerged through movements like New Museology, Southern Museologies, and Sites of Conscience, to name a few, to then redefine how museums are envisioned and realized. In Latin America and the Caribbean, experimental practices inspired international movements like the New Museology movement in the 1980s, which prioritized community-driven museum making and challenged dominant narratives. While larger Western institutions often struggle to move beyond performative discourse, community-born museums that adopted these approaches have led the way in innovation and impact, showcasing the transformative potential of grassroots museology and its relevance for broader implementation. Museums in the global south have often been seen as exclusive spaces, inaccessible due to economic, educational, linguistic, and cultural barriers, and have struggled with sustained visitation. In 2019, much more recently, Museum Futures Initiative in Africa introduced Southern Museologies as a people-centered concept. This new movement was led by African museum professionals in collaboration with the Goethe Institute, and it sought to innovate and adapt museums to better serve local communities and wider audiences. Museum Futures challenges traditional ideas of preservation, heritage, and participation by centering African communities' knowledge, experiences, and cultural practices. Its goal is to reshape museums' relevance across the continent through localized methodologies that prioritize indigenous and endogenous knowledge over universal frameworks. Their 2020 cohort expanded participation beyond Africa, including museums like the Conflictorium or Museum of Conflict in Ahmedabad and Raipur in India. This museum exemplifies how interdisciplinary approaches can address complex ideas by connecting art, archives, and audiences. And drawing on principles rooted in the Indian Constitution, it proposes conflict as everyday tensions and disruptions that reveal larger fears, shame, and guilt, creating miscommunication and boundaries between people. And its potential, when understood, or the potential of conflict, when understood in such a framework, to then foster peace. The Sites of Conscience movement emerged in 1999 when Ruth Abraham, then director of the Tenement Museum in New York, called on museums and heritage sites worldwide to form a coalition of socially responsible museums, addressing inequality, unresolved traumatic pasts, and social discrimination. An initial group of 9 Sites of Conscience championed the birth of the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, having memory as a foundation for truth and justice. Today, the coalition includes nearly 400 initiatives globally, advancing museums' roles in helping communities reflect, reconcile with their traumatic pasts, and foster transformation toward more just futures. Together, these and other museological frameworks emphasize inclusion, community engagement, and participatory practices developed over the past 50 years, offering a roadmap for creating institutions deeply rooted and relevant to their contexts. So now going back to my initial reflections, I would like to address the 4 critical questions that reflect the challenges and opportunities facing contemporary museums and are relevant for the development of a national museum for Djibouti. They are, how can museums connect the past and present to foster transformation? How can they engage in decolonial practices that challenge dominant narratives? How can they prioritize community-driven methods to ensure inclusivity and long-term relevance? And how can these approaches redefine our relationship with the natural world? Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, her warning about the danger of a single story highlights the risk of presenting narrow or hegemonic narratives that exclude voices and reinforce stereotypes. Historically, museums have contributed to this issue by privileging dominant voices while marginalizing others. One of the foremost roles of museums today is to serve as spaces for healing and transformation, reconnecting fragmented histories and honoring the plurality of voices and subjectivities of their contexts. Community center institutions like District 6 and Museum in South Africa demonstrate how museums can reclaim suppressed narratives by preserving the stories of communities forcibly removed under apartheid and in their own voices. The museum highlights the experiences of victims and survivors, their shared resilience, and their agency. And in doing so, it ensures that all those affected by forced displacement under apartheid and other contexts see themselves reflected and empowered, whether through narratives, objects, practices, or interpretation, while challenging mainstream stereotypes. Decolonial practices are reshaping museums worldwide by emphasizing local epistemologies. This transformation involves rethinking missions and structures, centering culturally relevant knowledge and practices, and addressing colonial legacies. A compelling example of the shift is the Correcting the Record initiative led by Sites of Conscience in 2022. This groundbreaking methodology recalibrates historic narratives and practices to amplify marginalized voices and promote inclusivity and challenge discrimination. By addressing gaps in representation and mitigating exclusion, the initiative fosters dynamic harmony in historical storytelling. Piloted with 6 sites of conscience across the global south, the project invited institutions to identify underrepresented communities and reevaluate their repositories and practices through an inclusive and equitable lens. Established museums gain tools to identify and address representation gaps, while emerging museums develop a framework to co create missions, programs, and practices with their communities. Through these inclusive approaches, museums not only corrected historical records, but strengthened their bonds with their communities and audiences and their long term relevance, transforming into living institutions co led by and in dialogue with the communities they serve. Sites of Conscience believes that no museum heritage memory initiative can achieve long term relevance and sustainability without infusing community ownership early in the planning process and throughout its development. Ground up processes centered on cooperation create a foundation for co creation as a shared path and a blueprint for future solidarity. This approach emphasizes building solidarity through a multiplicity of perspectives, cooperation, and power sharing, leading to a dynamic harmony of voices and experiences, where dynamic reflects the evolving understanding of the past and its impact on the present and future, while harmony ensures equity and diversity. On the other hand, our experience also shows that top down planning and development processes often lead to disputes over narrative dominance, undermining the ability to foster a dynamic harmony of voices and jeopardizing the initiative's future. This approach requires a fluid assessment of meaning making in the process, providing opportunities for continued and constructive dialogue and negotiations between many parties. The goal from a sites of conscience point of view is not to meld all perspectives into one that can be seen as singular, but to lift the very diversity of understandings and truths in a way that reflects the real complexity of historical narratives and lived experiences. Creating space to identify and amplify shared understandings with this diversity fosters processes that bridge differences and promote healing, solidarity, and peace. Again, the sustainability and relevance of museums are deeply connected to their relationship to their communities and communities they serve. Emerging global trends in museology highlight that inclusion, community engagement, and participatory practices are essential for the continued success of museums. The Mafalala Museum in Mozambique, for example, illustrates this approach by centering local voices and co-creating exhibits that reflect residents' lived experiences and help look into Maputo through the city of Maputo through the lens of its peripheries. There is an opportunity for museums in the Global South to also play a role in raising awareness about environmental crisis faced today by seeking to counter, as author Amitav Ghosh said in his book, The Nutmeg's Curse, Parables for a Planet in Crisis, the pervasive relationship between human beings and non-entities. The relationship between human being and non-human entities, seen as resources to be exploited. As he states, the great burden that now rests upon writers, artists, filmmakers, and everyone else who is involved in the telling of stories, to us, the task of imaginatively restoring agency and voice to non-humans. This is very important, I believe, for any museum of today. And Africa's museums are uniquely positioned to lead responses to this call by drawing on their heritage, cultural practices, and deeply rooted connection between humans, nature, and spirituality. This perspective offers a future-orientated approach to grounded in African philosophies, where sustainability and coexistence help address global challenges. So, what are the opportunities for the future Djibouti National Museum? At a practical level, these critical transformations of the last 50 years reversed Western approaches to museology and museography by emphasizing museums of narratives over museums of collections. On the other hand, museology, as the study of the role, purpose, and philosophy of museums, is increasingly, on one hand, museology as the study of the role, purpose, and philosophy of museums is increasingly focusing on the relationship between museums and communities, societal impact, and how they address cultural and historical narratives. On the other hand, museography, which deals with the practical and technical aspects of museum concretization and operation, such as exhibit design, spatial organization, lighting, and the physical presentation of collections, is shaped by these socially driven museological choices. The implications for museum making are many. For Djibouti's National Museum, the foundational step of a people-centered, community-driven approach should engage multiple stakeholders from the outset to collaboratively shape the museum's mission and programming. This involves establishing or understanding for whom, by whom, and with whom the museum will be planned, developed, implemented, and operated. This approach ensures that communities are at the heart of all museological and museographical decisions and create the conditions for participatory planning and co-creation to thrive. Co-creation is key because it goes beyond token participation, enabling communities to share decision-making power and ensuring that their voices, knowledge, and aspirations are authentically embedded in every stage and method adopted in the museum-making process. Only after these co-creative relationships are firmly established and the needs, expectations, and aspirations of the community are fully understood, can the focus shift to collectively and interdependently determining how these needs will be met, whose and what heritage, history, narratives, knowledge, and approaches are most relevant for the museum development, representation, and interpretation, and what type of institution, exhibits, and public programs will best meet these collective needs, and finally, where the museum should be located to maximize impact. The museum-making process should therefore rely on approaches such as establishing community councils, advisory groups that ensure equitable participation and decision-making throughout the museum's conceptualization, development, and operations. Any such structures should be based on equitable relationships that help build trust, ownership, and relevance. Cultural mapping by conducting and comprehensive effort to document the tangible and intangible heritage of Djibouti, emphasizing oral histories, local languages, traditional and indigenous knowledge systems, as well as silenced histories that may fuel discrimination and stereotypes. Um, Co-creating dynamic narratives, exhibits, and programs that reflect the complexity and plurality of Djiboutian identities, centering community resilience, agency, and correcting historical narratives. And finally, also embracing complexity and trauma by ensuring ethical approaches are used when addressing sensitive histories, acknowledging patterns of unresolved trauma, embracing all the layers that come with this, and fostering dialogue and healing. One of the most significant opportunities lies in elevating endogenous knowledge and challenging dominant narratives by rejecting, limiting Western centric frameworks and embracing decolonial, locally rooted museological practices. This entails integrating oral history, oral traditions, local art forms, traditional practices, and ecological knowledge into the museum's context and structure. Establishing layered knowledge repositories by creating repositories, exhibitions, programs that overlap diverse sources, including historical research, oral histories, religious influences, gender perspectives, and artistic interpretations, valuing diverse and layered identities. And also polyphonic storytelling by developing narratives that celebrate the multiplicity of Djiboutians' cultural and historical experiences, and also fostering a sense of ownership and pride. Museological approaches that emphasize participatory planning and co-creation and community engagement laid the foundations for museography shaped by these concepts that are then translated into physical spaces and exhibitions. This interconnected relationship between museology and museography ensures that theoretical principles are not only reflected in practice, but also physically fostering local relevance and long-term sustainability. Some important aspects of this approach, drawing from these innovative examples, museums must value local culture and talent, so highlight local and regional visual symbolism and culture, celebrating the contribution of local artists, scholars, voices, and architects, and etc. Also focus on optimized resources by prioritizing efficient, low-impact buildings and sustainable practices in programs, collections, and technologies. Also consider size and scale in relation to real needs and long-term feasibility. Choose a central location that minimizes transport and ensures accessibility for all, while exploring a decentralized model with satellite exhibits and community programs to broaden access. And also, museums must address diverse community needs by serving as multi-purpose spaces. Beyond exhibits, they can function as community centers, educational hubs, and spaces for recreation, creativity, and dialogue. And lastly, also ensure universal accessibility. Ensure that geographic, economic, physical, intellectual, and linguistic accessibility is met, for example, by considering multiple intelligences, layered information, and content tailored for different ages. Well, in conclusion, by embedding these approaches, Djibouti's National Museum can emerge as a global African model, demonstrating the transformative power of 21st century museums. It can project an aspirational vision that is locally grounded while resonating regionally and globally. Over the next 3 days, I encourage all participants to explore how a National Museum for Djibouti can prioritize ground-up participatory approaches. This include carefully considering the timing, stages, and methodologies necessary to bring these opportunities to life. By adopting such a process, the museum can avoid the pitfalls of top-down narratives, instead building a space that reflects the dynamic harmony of the nation's histories and identities and culture. It can also foster an ethical relationship between humans and the natural world while amplifying local voices in the global conversation for planetary well-being. In closing, Djibouti's National Museum has the potential to be a living institution, a site of healing, learning, and transformation. It can bridge past and present, uplift diverse narratives, and inspire collective vision for a just and inclusive future. As a global African museum making laboratory, it can become a beacon of resilience, innovation, and cultural pride for Djibouti, serving as an inspiration for museums worldwide. Thank you very much.